It began with a lie so large that almost no one questioned it. In the early years of the Cold War, as the world watched mushroom clouds rise from remote atolls, the United States quietly insisted that radioactive fallout from nuclear tests was minimal, harmless, and under control. Those reassurances were repeated with confidence, pushed through press conferences, government pamphlets, and scientific briefings. But behind the polished language and patriotic certainty, there was a problem so severe that America's most powerful institutions feared what would happen if the public ever learned the truth. Radioactive fallout was drifting across continents, settling into soil, into crops, into milk, and ultimately into human bodies. The government needed data, real data, on how much radiation people were absorbing. It needed proof that the great nuclear experiment of the era wasn't slowly poisoning the very citizens it claimed to protect. But the kind of data they required wasn't something they could collect legally, openly, or ethically. They needed to know exactly how radioactive particles behaved inside bones. And bones, small, developing bones, absorbed these particles most clearly. The most valuable samples were not from adults but from infants. The younger the remains, the cleaner the data, and the more tragic the story. This was the origin of Project Sunshine, one of the darkest chapters in Cold War research. No public debate, no consent, no accountability, just an order whispered through classified corridors: find bones, as many bones as possible. It did not matter where they came from. It did not matter who they belonged to. The only thing that mattered was science, or at least the version of science that served the nuclear state. Throughout the 1950s, a network of researchers working for government agencies and nuclear laboratories quietly spread around the globe. Hospitals were approached, pathologists were recruited, mortuaries and medical schools were contacted with discreet requests. They did not ask for whole bodies and they did not need them. They only needed pieces, particularly long bones, especially from the very young. And because infant and child mortality in some countries was high, opportunities were everywhere. The system adapted quickly, moving with unsettling ease. In many cases, grieving families were never told that the bodies they buried were not whole. In other cases, remains never reached their families at all. The operation grew larger and more organized with each passing year. Classified documents show researchers casually listing the number of specimens acquired, shipped, dissected, and analyzed, as if they were dealing with nothing more than lab materials purchased in bulk. But these weren't mere samples. They were remains of real children, taken without consent, without dignity, and without a single explanation. This was not an isolated crime committed by rogue actors. It was a coordinated effort fueled by fear of nuclear catastrophe and the desire to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. The justification was always framed as necessity. The Cold War demanded sacrifices, they believed, and the public, unaware of the true scope of nuclear contamination, was not given a choice in what those sacrifices would be. As the project expanded, investigators moved beyond American borders. Europe, Australia, Asia, anywhere they could quietly acquire remains. In several countries, government officials later admitted they had cooperated with U.S. requests, sometimes out of scientific curiosity, sometimes out of political alignment, and sometimes because they simply did not want to challenge American authority. Regardless of the reason, the result was the same: a global supply chain of stolen bones, carried in crates and envelopes, labeled with clinical codes designed to obscure the age of the deceased. Many of those labels hid the most disturbing detail of all, that some samples came from infants only days old. Each bone told a story. Some revealed alarmingly high levels of strontium-90, a radioactive isotope created during nuclear detonations. It behaved like calcium, flowing from contaminated milk into the bodies of the youngest and most vulnerable. The very discovery that scientists sought, the undeniable evidence that nuclear fallout had entered the global food chain, was now contained inside the remains they had stolen. This secret data contradicted public assurances from the highest levels of government. It showed that fallout was not harmless, it was not contained, and it was accumulating in the bones of children around the world. Inside laboratories, analysts understood the gravity of what they were seeing, but the chain of secrecy was absolute. Reports were classified, findings restricted, and the public narrative controlled. Nuclear testing continued. Officials continued to insist that everything was safe. The people who knew otherwise stayed silent. By the mid-1950s, the number of stolen remains had climbed into the thousands, though the true count may never be known. Records were incomplete, mislabeled, or destroyed. Some scientists later admitted that the exact total might be impossible to calculate because the project operated through so many unofficial channels. What began as a covert scientific mission had become something far more grotesque, a systematic violation hidden beneath patriotic rhetoric and scientific ambition. The truth remained buried, locked behind decades of classified files. Families who had lost children never knew that the bodies they mourned had been altered or dissected. Entire nations remained unaware that their mortuaries and hospitals had been quietly tapped into a global supply chain serving American nuclear research. And the United States, eager to maintain its image and its advantage, ensured that the public never saw the full picture. Project Sunshine survived because it lived in the shadows. It thrived because secrecy was easy to maintain in an era where nuclear fear justified almost anything. And it continued for years because the very institutions that should have protected the public were instead invested in hiding the truth from them. But secrets do not stay buried forever, and the first cracks in the facade, the first hints of what the government had done, were about to emerge. For years, Project Sunshine continued as a phantom operation, known only to a small circle of nuclear scientists, military planners, and government officials who understood what its existence meant. It was not just research. It was a quiet admission that nuclear fallout was far more dangerous than the public had ever been told. And yet, instead of confronting that danger, the authorities chose to hide it. As the 1950s unfolded, nuclear detonations multiplied across the Pacific and Nevada desert. The tests were celebrated as displays of strength, televised in sanitized clips that showed perfect white clouds drifting upward into blue skies. But what viewers never saw were the radioactive particles spreading for thousands of miles, settling invisibly into cities, farms, and water systems. Milk contaminated with strontium-90 entered homes without warning. Infants drank it, pregnant mothers consumed it, and each nuclear test left more behind. Inside classified research centers, scientists saw the trend with growing alarm. The data was undeniable. Bones collected from infants showed levels of strontium-90 that increased year after year. Some samples revealed concentrations that should have sparked immediate global concern, but secrecy outweighed transparency. To admit the danger meant admitting responsibility. To admit responsibility meant facing the consequences of decades of dismissals and false assurances. Instead, Project Sunshine intensified. Researchers refined their methods, creating a system that operated with disturbing efficiency. Hospitals were instructed to alert them whenever infant deaths occurred. Some mortuaries were told to set aside remains automatically. Medical schools quietly forwarded samples without ever informing families. In certain countries, local officials cooperated out of diplomatic obligation, signing off on shipments they never fully questioned. Everything happened quietly, smoothly, as if the moral barrier had already been crossed long ago. In some cases, parents were told that their child's body was unavailable for immediate burial due to routine post-mortem procedures. They were never told that bones had been removed. They were never told that the remains had been shipped to another continent. They were never told that their loss was transformed into data for nuclear planners. The deception was not random, it was systematic. Sunshine researchers were instructed to avoid paperwork that might expose the program. Many samples were logged with vague descriptions. Male, infant, specimen from Europe, neonate sample. Some arrived with no identifying information at all. The less recorded, the less traceable. And for those funding the operation, that was the safest approach. Inside government briefing rooms, reports circulated that contradicted the official line given to the public. They showed that radioactive contamination had entered the global food chain. They showed that fallout levels in human bones rose even in populations thousands of miles from test sites. And they showed that nuclear testing, proudly marketed as safe, carried consequences no one had ever admitted aloud. Yet the machinery of secrecy held firm. Nuclear research required silence. Project Sunshine required denial. And the public, trusting, uninformed, and reassured by official statements, remained unaware of what was happening behind the curtain. It was not until the late 1950s that the first subtle cracks appeared. Independent scientists around the world began measuring radiation in rainwater, soil, and milk. Their findings clashed with official government statements. They did not have access to Sunshine's classified bone data, yet their results pointed to the same conclusion. Radioactive fallout was widespread, measurable, and increasing. Public pressure began to rise. Anti-nuclear activists demanded transparency. Mothers' groups questioned the safety of milk. Journalists turned their attention toward the expanding nuclear test programs. The government responded with calm, confident dismissals, assurances designed to quiet any hint of panic. But behind closed doors, officials knew that the truth was becoming harder to contain. By 1961, the classified charts displaying strontium-90 accumulation showed a trend that could no longer be rationalized away. Infants born that year had higher levels than those born a decade earlier. Each nuclear test left another invisible layer of contamination settling across entire continents. If exposure increased at the same pace, the health consequences could soon become impossible to hide. Still, Project Sunshine never slowed. In fact, as global concern grew, researchers were pressured to gather even more samples, faster, more diverse, more geographically distributed. They expanded into more hospitals, more cities, more foreign countries. Every new sample confirmed what officials already knew. The nuclear age had poisoned the world far more deeply than anyone publicly admitted. What made the project so chilling was not only the theft of remains, it was the indifference. The steady, emotionless way the data was collected, filed, and charted. To those running Sunshine, the children whose bones they studied were never treated as individuals. They were data points in a global radiation map. They were tools, not lives. And yet, the most disturbing reality was this. The U.S. government believed the secrecy was justified. Officials argued that revealing the truth would jeopardize national security, undermine public confidence, and weaken the nation during the most intense phase of the Cold War. They believed that the public did not need to know how radioactive the world had become. But secrecy has its limits, and as international pressure mounted for a ban on atmospheric nuclear testing, Project Sunshine started to play a new role, not only as a research effort, but as a silent witness to what the nuclear era had already done. When leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union debated the future of nuclear testing, they did so with Sunshine's data at their fingertips. They knew the fallout levels. They knew the contamination rates. They knew how deeply strontium-90 had penetrated human biology. And while no one publicly acknowledged the source of this knowledge, Sunshine's findings quietly shaped one of the most consequential policy shifts of the century. By the early 1960s, the world was inching toward the partial test ban treaty. But while diplomatic talks unfolded, Project Sunshine continued collecting remains, continued testing, continued operating in secret. Because even as governments prepared to limit nuclear detonations, the long-term effects of decades of fallout were still unknown, and officials wanted answers, no matter the cost. The families whose children were taken never learned what happened. Hospitals never admitted their role, and the truth about Project Sunshine remained buried inside classified vaults, hidden from the very people affected by it the most. But the era of absolute secrecy was ending. Investigators, journalists, and scientific whistleblowers were starting to uncover pieces of the story. Not everything, not enough to see the full scope, but enough to raise questions that the government could not silence forever. And soon, the hidden network behind Project Sunshine, the thefts, the lies, the cover-ups would begin to unravel. By the early 1960s, Project Sunshine existed in a state of unstable balance, hidden, operational, and essential to the government's understanding of nuclear fallout, yet increasingly difficult to conceal. The scientific world was changing. Independent researchers were no longer content to accept official statements about radiation safety. Activist groups were organizing, journalists were investigating, and the Cold War's relentless pace had begun to fracture the silence surrounding nuclear testing. It was only a matter of time before the shadows protecting the program collapsed. The first real crack came not from an insider, but from a quiet accumulation of scientific evidence. University researchers around the world had begun measuring strontium-90 in everything from wheat to cow's milk. Their findings were remarkably similar to those recorded in the classified Sunshine reports, but the government maintained its unwavering calm, dismissing concerns as misunderstandings or exaggerations. Official spokesmen repeated the same comforting line: the fallout was harmless, the exposure negligible, the public safe. Yet behind the scenes, Sunshine's data showed the opposite. The contamination in human bones was climbing, and the pace was accelerating. The evidence could not be reframed or softened. Radiation levels in children, especially infants, were among the clearest indicators of long-term danger, and the scientists working inside the program knew that their findings contradicted the narrative being broadcast to the world. The pressure intensified when advocates for a nuclear test ban demanded transparency. They wanted to know what governments were hiding. They wanted hard numbers, not carefully crafted public statements. Sunshine's architects responded by tightening the program even further. Security restrictions multiplied. Reports were separated, compartmentalized, and locked away. Only a handful of officials knew the full scope of what the project had done. But secrecy has a natural enemy, time, and time was running out. In 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed, ending atmospheric nuclear detonations. Publicly, leaders celebrated the treaty as a triumph for global safety. Privately, it was an acknowledgement of the growing evidence that fallout had become a real threat. Sunshine's data had played a pivotal role in shaping that decision, yet the public was never told why the treaty had become so urgent. The program did not end immediately after the treaty. Instead, it shifted. The government needed to track the long-term effects of the fallout already spread across the world. Tests continued quietly, focusing on samples collected before the ban. But the urgency faded, and with it, the protective shield surrounding the operation began to thin. For nearly a decade, Project Sunshine remained buried inside government archives. It was referenced occasionally in internal memos, briefly discussed in closed committee sessions, but never publicly acknowledged. Its existence was too damaging. To explain, it meant explaining the secret removal of remains from hundreds of families. It meant revealing that children had been used as measurement tools, without consent and without mercy. No official wanted to bear that responsibility. Then, in the late 1960s, researchers studying nuclear safety stumbled upon vague references to large-scale global radiological analysis programs. They requested access to historical data. Bureaucrats exchanged cautious letters. Files were reviewed. Some documents were withheld. Others were released accidentally or without full context. And slowly, piece by piece, fragments of Project Sunshine began to reappear in scientific literature, stripped of detail, devoid of scandal, but recognizable enough to raise questions. The real exposure came in 1973, when a government committee investigating the effects of radiation released a transcript referencing human samples collected without consent. The language was clinical, almost sterile, but the meaning was unmistakable. Bodies had been taken, bones removed, parents kept uninformed. Journalists obtained the transcript and began asking questions that officials could no longer avoid. The response was immediate denial, then discomfort, then a reluctant admission that certain studies had indeed taken place. Officials attempted to frame the project as a necessary measure of the era, a scientific effort conducted in the interest of national safety. But as more documents surfaced, the narrative collapsed. Records showed that samples had been taken not only from the United States but from Europe, Asia, and Australia. Many deaths had nothing to do with radiation. Some infants had died from pneumonia, infections, or complications at birth. Yet their remains were harvested all the same. And worst of all, families were never told. When the truth reached the public, the outrage was immediate. Newspapers published headline after headline condemning the program. Families demanded answers. Advocacy groups called for investigations. Medical institutions distanced themselves. And for the first time since its creation, Project Sunshine was forced out of the shadows. Government spokesmen claimed the program was a product of its time, a Cold War necessity. They insisted that secrecy was essential to avoid panic. They emphasized that the data had contributed to global safety by supporting nuclear regulation. But none of those explanations satisfied the families whose children had been taken. None justified the deception, the concealment, the silent extraction of bones from tiny bodies entrusted to medical care. The moral cost remained impossible to explain away. The scandal triggered a series of public hearings. Testimony from scientists revealed that the project's operations were more extensive than previously admitted. In some cases, bones were removed even when families believed a full body had been buried. Morticians testified that they had been instructed to comply. Hospitals acknowledged participating without fully understanding the purpose. Governments of other nations expressed anger, claiming they had been misled about the nature of the research. Yet even as the story exploded into public consciousness, large portions of the project remained classified. Many documents were redacted. Some were destroyed. Others were buried behind layers of bureaucratic obstruction. The full number of children taken has never been conclusively established. Estimates range widely, some say hundreds, others say thousands. What became undeniable was the truth at the heart of Project Sunshine. In the pursuit of nuclear dominance, the U.S. government crossed ethical boundaries that should have been unthinkable. The global nuclear race had demanded certainty about fallout, and to obtain that certainty, officials chose to violate the trust of grieving families. The scandal faded eventually, overshadowed by new crises and shifting political priorities. But the legacy of Project Sunshine remains, a testament to the darkest corners of Cold War science, where secrecy overrode conscience, and where the smallest, most innocent victims became data in a global experiment no one was meant to see. And despite the partial revelations, the full story of Project Sunshine still lies buried in archives, locked behind classifications that persist to this day. Its consequences continue in silence, long after the children whose bones were taken have been forgotten by the institutions that used them. But their story, once uncovered, refuses to disappear. It stands as a reminder of what governments are willing to do when fear becomes policy, secrecy becomes routine, and the value of a human life becomes secondary to the pursuit of power.